Okay, we're going to look at some fractional indices now in a bit of a roundabout way that will get us hopefully some understanding. So if we look at something like 64 is a number you recognise, and that is 8 times 8. That's not that surprising, that's a thing we know. Now we're also going to look at some index laws to help us look this a different way. 64 is also 64 cubed divided by 64 squared. And we should know that because the index law for division is 3 take away 2 is the 1, and 64 to the power of 1 is 64. So there's lots of ways to get to 64. Let's do one other. 64 to the negative 7 times 64 to the 10 times 64 to the negative 2. Well, negative 7 plus 10 is 3, take away 2 is 1, so it's 64 to the 1. So we can use index laws as long as our bases are the same to link things up. So now let's look at fractions. Look at some fractions. What about 64 squared? Now I want this to be 64 to the power of 1 because I want to get 64. So I've got to put some power in here in this space. And you should know the index law here is multiplying these things together. So 2 times something gets us 1. Well, what could that something be? It's got to be a half. 2 times a half is 1. So here we've got our first appearance of a fractional index, and working out what it's doing is quite useful here. Can you think of a number you could have squared to get 64? Oh, we've seen that before. This is 8 squared. So 8 squared is 64. We know that. So because this whole thing here, when it's squared, is 64, and this thing here is 64, when this thing is squared, it's 64. That means that 64 to the power of a half must be 8. How could we, what relationship is there between 64 and 8 that this must be explaining, this must be linked to? Well, 64 to the power of a half must be the square root of 64, because that's what 8 is compared to 64. So these fractional powers are to do with roots. So to put that a bit more concrete, we'll do a couple of these. So if we have some number, the power of a half, that is the square root of that number. If we have some number to the power of a third, that is the cube root of that number. If we have some number to the power of 17, power of a 17th, that is the 17th root of that number. And if we put in some values here, 25 to the half is whatever the square root of 25 is. Well, that's 5. Let's do 64 to the power of a third. Well, that is the cube root of 64, which you should have learnt is 4. If we do something like 1,000,000 to the power of a sixth, that is the 6th root of 1,000,000, which happens to be 10. And we can check that because 10 times 10, that's 3 of them, 4, 5, 6, that's 6 of these lined up. And that is a 1 with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 zeros, and that is the same thing. So a fractional power is a root. And if you know what the value's root is, that's easy, but algebraically it's the same thing, it's just a root. And that works the other way. The cube root of 125 is 125 to the power of a third. You can swap either way and it's equally true. So that is what fractional indices mean, and there'll be some questions on that you can do to practice this.